Last month, I decided to make a roguelike game in just 1 month, and I technically didn't quite finish it. So I'm going to up the ante again and make a game in a week. And an extra weekend on top of that. On a mission to sustain my annual Apple developer's license cost, I wanted to brainstorm another game idea with a much smaller scope. Some time ago, I attempted to enter one of the Ludum Dare game jams. I came up with a game called Starship Danger, but never quite finished it and it never really came together. It was a top-down space shooter where you fly around this area. Couldn't quite get the flying to feel right and I kind of just abandoned it. So I was left with these assets and this kind of aesthetic that I was actually really happy with. I don't think it should go to waste and I wanted to reuse it in some way. So after I got thinking, I brainstormed some ideas and got to work. So for the first day, I made a copy of the project and just spent a good amount of time adjusting everything and removing all the scripts that were irrelevant and stripping everything back to the bare minimum from the original project. I mainly started getting the camera perspective correct. Ideally, I wanted the camera and the player to stay in the same location while the objects around it moved downwards. The starry parallaxing background piece used to sit under the camera and just move when the camera and the player moved. So instead I set it to auto-scroll downwards. Then I set the spaceship's movement to react to the player dragging their finger around on the screen. And then added some box colliders around the border of the camera. By the end of the day I had multiple asteroids spawning, randomly generating 1 to 3 per row. The player could shoot and destroy small asteroids but not crash into them just yet. Day 2, I continued tweaking the spawning algorithm, where each piece now has a weight to its spawn, so it's not all big asteroids blocking the whole way. I had a problem where asteroids were spawning on top of each other and then fixed that. Next, it was time to implement enemy ships I had originally designed. First starting with these laser beams in 3 different variants. They create a different kind of barrier that can be longer or create a smaller gate in between. They also have a smaller window than asteroids to destroy, since they have to be shot in the small little piece that points the laser and not the laser itself. Next was the patrol bot, which randomly changes between one of 3 locations and has a gun that points and shoots at the player. Then the spinning bot, which just consistently rotates. I then went back to the spawning algorithms and adjusted it so it progressively gets faster every 30 seconds. I then set a cap on how fast it can be, which is about after 10 minutes of playing, it'll reach full speed. I also set it to warm the player up when first starting, as it'll introduce 2 lanes of objects after about 15 seconds, then 3 lanes of objects after about 30 seconds, before introducing the enemy ships at 45 seconds. Then to wrap up the day, I created a complete gameplay loop by making this simple UI with points, player health, and a game over screen when the player dies. In the game, I want the player to be able to make multiple upgrades, so I started on the save system to store all the info. So now the player has all these stats that can be loaded and saved based on what I think they'll need so far. Now that this is ready, the player can collect stardust from the objects that they destroy. So nothing too interesting today, but it is laying the groundwork for the shop system. Now, these days kind of just blurred together and ended up being a long, tedious process, way more than I expected. Deciding how I wanted each window to look, where to place everything, grouping what upgrades with what, how it knows what items to upgrade with what descriptions, creating a small algorithm that calculates how much each item will cost based on what level it is, making the UI unlock and change when others unlock and complete, and then testing to make sure it works all the way through with every single button prompt. All the things a more dynamic, well-prepared system could do, something I have done before, but I thought the shop system I wanted was way too simple for that, and I was wrong. I also added these smooth little transition animations, which was a lot quicker to do than everything else. Then I carved out a little logo for this main menu. But hey, it's all done now and it works, and I'm sure you can't break it, and I'm sure you'll never see how much spaghetti is hiding under the hood, because you'll be impressed with these super smooth panel animations. Now that every upgrade can be purchased, I can start implementing all of the ones that don't function yet. So starting with the 2 abilities, I created this little UI down here for the buttons. The first one being the player shield. Basically, this is an emergency protection if the player can't get away from an enemy bullet or a set of obstacles. The shield will last for about 2 to 4 seconds and have a cooldown of about 20 to 30 seconds depending on the player's level of upgrades. The second ability is the secondary attack that shoots out a massive wave of lasers to deal about 5 damage to everything it sees. It's really satisfying. The cooldown and damage dealt also depends on how much the player has upgraded it. The next 2 are the Stardust filter and point modifiers. The Stardust filter will increase the amount of standard Stardust collected at the end of a run, multiplying the amount by 1.1, 1.2, and 1.3, depending on the level of the upgrade. The point modifier will double and triple the player's points they are earning when they have managed to avoid damage for a period of 20 or 30 seconds, When the player takes a hit, the counter resets back to 0 and the regular amount of points will be distributed. I also ended the day by changing the HP system to these little knobs instead of numbers, and quickly drew up this little stat screen with the amount of time the player has spent in the game and total amount of Stardust they have collected minus their purchases and also their high score. And that takes me to the end of the challenge in terms of the time frame that I set, and I'd say the game is about 90% complete. It is just missing a few things and I haven't done any sound at all yet. We need to create the settings menu and I want to come up with a few more enemy ship designs. Since this isn't a game jam and there's no impeding deadline, I have the opportunity to stick with all the envisioned features I want, so extending the challenge by a couple of days seems like a good idea. But in these quiet moments, a question lingers. What truly defines a completed game? The missed deadline whispers a tale of humanity's pursuit of perfection, forever entwined with the elusive mirage of completion, a dance between creation and constraint. Like the universe itself, the boundaries we perceive are but fleeting illusions, and the notion of true finality remains tantalizingly distant. My creation stands not only as a testament to this inherent paradox, but also as an embodiment of the infinite nestled within the finite. Just as the artist's canvas beckons for eternal strokes, so do games invite ongoing exploration. So thanks to ChatGPT, I have my excuse to continue, because who ever released an unfinished game before? Now the game is awfully dead silent at this point, which is kind of like space, but without sound it feels largely unsatisfying. So I pulled out my keyboard and started playing around with all the synths that I have and then got to work. I started with the main menu theme song that sounds like this, that eventually goes into a long droning bass synth. Then I made some sound effects for the buttons, transitions to the start of gameplay, the secondary attack, the shield, and the upgrade sounds. After I created the sound system, I implemented them into the game and I began working on the gameplay theme. Which starts off with some aggressively sweeping arpeggios and then moving into an easier melody. It came out a bit too aggressive for the gameplay, but it is called Starship Danger after all. I then spent quite a bit of time coming up with sound effects for combat. I was trying to use the more synth sounds, but couldn't create anything useful for shooting, hit, or explosion effects. I eventually just defaulted to using SFXR, which sounds a little bit more retro, but it ended up coming out okay anyway. I then ended with setting up the settings menu and created the last couple of enemies. I then created a set of simple bots that just block the path and another that moves back and forth constantly that also doesn't shoot the player this time. So after the game was complete, I sat on it for about a week or so and did some playtesting, looked for bugs, and started getting it ready for release. Because as cool as it is when everyone does these make a game in X amount of hours or days challenges, I still want to put some actual care and quality into the final result a little bit more. I know we all hate ads and it sucks that I have to include them, but it's just how it rolls in the mobile market, so I added some video rewards and an interstitial video that plays every time you die 5 times, with the option to remove all these ads with a single purchase. Now, this whole process took longer than actually making the game itself, and it took me like 2 weeks. I didn't really document any of this, so at this point it's all kind of a blur. With Google, I had problems getting the users Google Play Games to sign in. All these problems kind of started around when I was trying to create a signing key that I broke, and then spent several days emailing back and forth with Google, who were honestly for the most part useless and only knew how to send me links to like irrelevant documentation. I then created another project just for testing. I had problems resolving dependencies in Unity with their package, which turned out to be caused by the project folder path itself having a symbol in it because of how I named the game, which just completely breaks Java when it tries to run or needs to be called or something. After I recreated the OU Auth client Google Cloud sign-in part of things several times, it turns out I hadn't added my email to one of the 3 test user lists that was secretly hiding. iOS was a little bit more straightforward, but still took a few days. I had to completely rebuild my my Mac, that is very slow. I had to rebuild it completely because I ran out of storage and couldn't expand it properly. And then once that was up and running, I just had to fix some weird issues in Xcode. And I've done all of this before, by the way, so it should have taken me only a couple days, but here we are a few weeks later. I will be writing myself a step-by-step guide for next time, since the resources were pretty limited and outdated, and Google have changed a few things, making tutorials not so accurate anymore. And then I'll probably make a Google Play tutorial to capitalize off my suffering from this. But after waiting for each store to complete their reviews of the game is out now, and you can play it on iOS and Android from the links below. If you guys go and download it and play it, I would honestly be extremely grateful. If the game does well enough, there's a possibility that I can do a follow-up video and some kind of update for the game, because I have ideas that are really only worth it if enough people play it and spend enough time in the game itself. Now that's all done, I'm going to go and fix my sleep schedule.